let's invite Prime Minister to put forward the affirmative case. Thank you very much.
Tess, am I audible?
Yes, I just want to remind you that probably you need to keep your own time. Thank you very much.
Yep, yeah, I'm timing myself as well. About the perhaps introduction within the Discord voice channel, is there something that I have to do before I start my speech?
Yeah, I think that probably we need to be doing that in just on the Discord, so not necessary to do that here because it is live streamed now.
Cool. I'm just going to start right away then. We think that it is time to provide children the truth of the world and how the world actually looks like. That nobody is truly only evil or nobody is truly only good within the instance where they live their life. We think there is an absolute need for children to be able to recognize that fact, for them to be able to make better decisions in the future. I have a few points of clarifications before I move on to the argumentations of this debate. The first, what is this debate necessarily about? So this debate is necessarily about an assessment of the nature of how children's literature look like and how it affects the worldviews of children at the end of the day. The burden for each team then necessarily is this, that the team should provide that the kind of literature that children's literature that they support would provide the best worldviews for children, for them to best make the decisions for themselves. Negative, I think, just as a form of clarity here, have to prove why gross mischaracterization of the world is the best way to go, and why lying towards children is the best way to go for these children to be able to get the worldviews that they like to have. So third clarification, what kind of children literature do we support then under our side of the house? We would prefer for the label to be largely blurry when it comes to good and bad. These are stories like, for example, Robin Hood, where he might be capable of evil, i.e. stealing from rich people, but he's also capable of helping the vulnerable, i.e. using that stolen property and money to help the poor, to help the hungry. We think the second point of context here in regards to things that we prefer is also that we will also prefer for the writers and authors to have children literature to have more contextual character arcs. For evidence of this is, for example, Zuko in the Last Airbender, a children literature basically, given that it's anime and watched by children, where he is evil in the beginning, or he's deemed as evil in the beginning because he killed multiple individuals, he tortured individuals for the name of the Fire Nation. But later, the consumers were given the contextual character arcs where he was abused by his father, where he is forced to seek validation from the dad because of particularly that reason, and that the mom sacrificed her life for him in particular, thus that made him act in a certain way. But when that character shift happened for Zuko, that was what changed the minds of individuals who consume The Last Airbender in regards to whether or not a person is necessarily good or bad. We support those kind of children literature. Now, let's just make it also very clear why it must happen at the stage where these individuals or these, when they're still children, basically. We think that when it comes to, if you to try to change or shift the worldviews of individuals who are already teenagers, it becomes much harder because certain values are already internalized. For example, if you were to have already internalized beauty standards that a princess have to be white, that someone who is beautiful have to have blonde hair, at that point of time it becomes much harder for you to be able to break that particular narrative that you have internalized for decades already when you're very young. That's why it must happen now. Now, I would like to just preempt the argumentations coming from opposition when it comes to whether or not children will be able to absorb that complexity and that blurred lines between good and evil. We think that with more normalization, these complex concepts become something that causes a massive learning curve for children and causes them to be able to internalize those decisions within the characters or within the stories even better. We think that it is especially as of right now, where children are seen to be more empathetic and have access towards information and technology, where they're better able to make decisions at a much faster rate compared to their older counterparts or their parents, for example. I think at this point of time, at least they can understand, or even if you don't buy that, the harm for them not being able to absorb those complex concepts is largely minimalized. That's what the context is, what negative should definitely approach with. Now, two arguments for you today. The first, why we ought to give children the truth of the world to best prepare them for the future. Now, why is it that the black and white narrative of good and evil factually untrue for the world? Isn't that people often value and prioritize things in a very subjective manner? This leads to differences in preferences when it comes to actions or decisions that are taken by individuals. These things are often influenced by perhaps moral structures from where they live in, or perhaps the preference of that particular society at that point of time. But when it's black and white, there is a delineation clearly made by that particular author to say that these decisions are wrong, that things that are not in line with that particular stories are wrong. It doesn't capture the differences that individuals often have and the differences of values that people often prioritize at the end of the day. Then why is it that we principally owe it to children to give them the truth then? We think that given that the actions of them in the future, after they have absorbed those values, it affects them and them directly. Now, how do these children absorb these values at the end of the day? When they consume things like Snow White, for example, a literal story about the beauty standards of how women should be, red lips, white skin as pale as snow, and hair as black as the night, those things are internalized for children, especially, and these are extremely pernicious for minority children, for example, who would never be able to truly change themselves in the way that those standards are imposed on them at the end of the day. Or for example, that within these stories, it imposes children to be more excellent in academics, for example, so that they can make their parents proud. Those things change the way in which they view themselves. How does it directly affect them then? I think that it comes in three prongs. The first is that it affects how they make friends, right? Where they become overly judgmental without knowing the context or or without having enough information about those particular individuals. So for example, if they were to look at someone who is probably not within the standard of a beauty standard that was set in Snow White, perhaps someone who is rather old, or perhaps someone who is not fair, we think at that point in time they become judgmental and toxic towards those particular individuals, and that harms the way in which they enjoy their life because their friends are highly limited towards the groups that they prefer. The second is that it also affects the way they view themselves. At the point where they are unable to reconcile with the fact that they cannot make their parents proud through academic excellence, they self-blame themselves, they become overly critical over themselves, which in multiple instances, especially for children in Asia, it leads to depression and death. Those things are extremely pernicious for children. The third reason as to why it's extremely harmful is that it also affects how they treat others. This is slightly contingent with the first level just now, where perhaps when it comes to them viewing their parents or abusing them, at the point where they feel indebted towards their parents, or at the point where these parents gaslight them by saying, I've provided you food, I've provided you shelter, at that point of time, it becomes much harder for these children to perhaps tell the truth in court, or to perhaps keep their parents accountable, to say it to their sisters, maybe to say it to their grandmothers, for example, to at least keep those entities accountable, because they just find it so hard to think that those individuals are evil. Now, the second argument is in regard to how it affects them in the future, at least on the outside of the house. The first, that children would not make judgments without the necessary information on the outside of the house. That the literature now provides them with more capacity to build their own empathy, because they have to hold until they have the full story, or the story from the other side first, before they make a moral judgment on towards a certain particular individual. The second reason as to why it's extremely good as well is that children are now better equipped at weighing their decisions, given that the literature provide them the critical thinking skills to be able to weigh their decisions based on the context of a certain option, for example. That gives them the ability to also make the best decisions for themselves, and not to necessarily perhaps deprive themselves of happiness if they view themselves as objectively bad at that point of time. We think it becomes complex, and that's the information that they necessarily have to have. Thanks.
Okay, we thank first F. Now let's move on to first NEC to open up the case on the negative side.
I'm so sorry, but can I just have 1 minute to go to the bathroom? I'm so sorry.
It's
Can I?
okay. Yeah.
Thank you. Just 1 to 2 minutes. I'll be right back.
No worries. Speakers on the affirmative side, would you like to introduce yourself? I seem to have forgot about that part. I really apologize.
So I spoke first just now. My name is Zazwan. I would also be doing reply.
Thank you very much, Zazwan.
Hannah.
And second F?
Yeah, second F, Hannah. She, her, please.
Third F is
no gender pronoun, just your name. Thank you very much. Thank you. And Gafwip?
Yeah, I'm Gafwip, Sila. My name is
Sila.
Sila.
Nice to meet you, Sila. And first, Neg?
Yeah, I'm back. My name is Simrat, first Neg.
Second Neg?
My name is Arshad. I'll be second and also be replying.
Oh, thank you.
I'm the third negative speaker, Tahmid.
Coming. Okay, thank you very much.
All right, I'm just gonna time myself. All right. Starting in 3, 2, 1. I have a lot of problems with the case coming from F just for a few reasons, right? They like to portray, they came across to portray these children as people who can actually who can actually have critical thinking skills and actually have all these things where they can actually decide for themselves what is good and what is wrong, right? And there was also almost lack of characterization coming from side of F, right? So in my speech today, I'm going to do a few things. The first thing, I'm going to characterize a few things in this debate. I'm going to tell you what is the priority that should be in this debate, and then I'm going to move on to my arguments, right? So a few characterizations. I think it's important in this debate we analyze who are the main stakeholders. Obviously, it's children. How do we characterize these children? These children are generally young. They can be aged between 5 to 10 years old.
Hold. She just got muted. Hold on.
Yeah, okay. Should I continue or start?
Yeah.
Start over?
Probably
Okay.
I would prefer you start over because you just started less than 1 minute.
Cool. Yeah, cool. All right. Just starting now. So as I've told you, I have a few problems with a case coming from F, right? They like to characterize children as people who can actually have critical thinking skills. So in this debate, I'm going to do a few characterizations. What is the priority in this debate? And moving on to my first argument. So who are the stakeholders in this debate? The stakeholders in this debate are children, right? These children are from 6 years old to like maybe 10 years old, right? This means that these children are most likely these children are very young. That means they most likely cannot make their own decisions, and they also like rely on like role models. This can be like their parents or what to teach them what is good and what is bad. So this is where children literature comes into this play, right? It's important to understand that children literature has, yes, it has some a huge influence on children, right? Most likely these parents, read books to their children every single day, right? So how are these characters most likely perceived in these books? Number one, most likely they have glorified goodness. So acts such as like kindness, empathy, and all these are glorified. And also the characters are also portray bad characteristics. For example, like I know if you steal and stuff like that. Why is this bad characteristics and good characteristics important, right? Which is what we are fighting for in this debate. It is important because these shows the consequences of these actions, right? They show you the consequences of these actions, right? What happens when you remove this from when you remove this from these children? It naturally harms the children a lot more, and it impacts the way that that they think, right? Okay, so what are the problems that exist in the problems that are coming from F case today? I think it's very important that there's this whole narrative that you are so careful and you want to teach children everything at such a young age, and you would just want to dump these concepts on them, which is particularly not necessary, right? Because I think we need to understand the concept of childhood in this debate and how precious childhood is to a child, right? When you grow up, you listen to all these stories of I don't know, like Robin Hood, Red Riding Hood, right? And Cinderella, and you kind of get to see the good characteristics that exist within this person, right? This is important because when you are a child, it is important that you teach. It is okay for you to have blind optimism, and in this way, the child is going to be a more positive child at the end of the day. And we are trying to impact this on the child, right? We are not trying to throw all these complex narratives on a 5-year-old and make sure that he understands. It is okay for the child to have blind optimism. And this is in direct response to F, because F said that we need to teach this child the truth of the world. No, we don't. It is okay for the child to have black and white between good and bad. And we're going to prove to you this, we're going to prove to you why. And F also tried to bring up that, no, the more you bring these values in, they're going to normalize the way they absorb. This is a mere assumption. There is no, you cannot, this is not a guarantee that all children are going to understand why is this, not going to understand why is this good, why is this bad, and they're going to have this ambiguity that's going to exist in their head, which is something that we don't want, right? Next, they also say that children are going to change the view of themselves, the way they view themselves. I don't think this is important in this debate because, like, children generally do not criticize themselves at all. So children are the most positive people that exist. They are so optimistic about life, and that is the beauty of being a child. So we don't understand why you want to throw these like narratives on them and make them decide what is good, what is bad, when they most likely idolize these good characters in these books anyway, right? So what are the priorities in this debate? We are trying to teach when people are children, they are most likely going to be irrational. And we tell you that it is okay for you to teach children between good and bad. Why? It is okay to have in black and white, because as they grow up, they are most likely going to learn that there is a good and there is a bad, and they are most likely also going to understand the gray area that exists within this, right? And this is a direct response to F, because they think that these children are going to read these stories and grow up with these stories. No, most likely they are going to grow up into rational adults. I read Cinderella. We all read Cinderella as a child, and we all grew up into rational adults at the end of the day, right? And also they try to bring up this thing about children are going to start judging themselves based on beauty standards. I don't think this is the truth, because we can also include minorities in these stories. That's not necessarily a problem. And also, like I told you, children are very optimistic and very loving. And this is a lot better, because we tell you on our side of the world, it is important for children to have a positive mindset, right? Because children generally idolize these characters, and when they idolize these good characters, they are most likely going to feel safer, as there is a hero-villain concept in their head, and they are most likely going to find comfort in these characters, right? So why does this have to, moving on to my first argument, right? Why does there have to be a distinction between good and evil, right? Because in books, there is generally a glorification of good people, right? And these children most likely want to become these characters, right? Because as children, they are heroes and they are villains, and children have the narrative and have the concept that they're going to idolize certain people, right? So when you take this away, there's going to be an ambiguity between them. Like, is this person bad? Is this person good? Who do I actually idolize? And this is going to confuse the child at the end of the day. So on our side, we focus on the character of these people, irregardless of their circumstances, whether they do good things or or bad things, which is what F wants to bring up, right? They say that people are going to act based on their circumstances, and this is what we want to teach to people. We tell you, no, we are going to focus on these good characters and the bad characters, right? Because when children tend to focus on the good characters, it teaches, when books glorify these good characters, it teaches children to be good regardless of their circumstances. It doesn't matter in the real world if later on they understand that people are good or bad because of circumstances. It doesn't matter, because as children, you want them to be good regardless of their circumstances. You want to teach them at a very young age that even if you cannot steal, stealing is bad even if you don't have money, right? That's something you want to teach, right? With the children, note here that the children most likely want to follow the footsteps of these characters, and they are most likely going to be influenced by these people's actions, right? So it is more easier for you to cement these attributes to this child through these good characters and teach these children like what is bad, right? This is very, very important, right? Because this teaches children to be good. For example, if you look at Spider-Man, right? He's a broke person, and he could most likely rob a bank, but no, he chose to do good with the superpowers that they have. And children idolize Spider-Man. They appreciate him, right? This teaches children specifically that they have a choice. And this is what happens when you have a clear distinction between what is good and what is bad. In their alternative, they would most likely want to teach children that, oh, you focus on the circumstances by which people do good or bad. We tell you that children are most likely not going to understand these circumstances anyway, and they're going to be confused. And this is very harmful, because then it justifies you to do, it teaches children that it justifies you to do certain things because of your circumstances, which is not something we would want to teach children at the end of the day. We are a lot happy with them being good or bad, right? This impacts the child a lot more, because then the child is most likely going to be a lot confident as a child. He's going to grow up to be a lot optimistic, and he's most likely going to appreciate the good in the world a lot more, because children are always going to be influenced by the good there is in the world today. So with all those reasons, very proud to oppose. Thank you.
Okay, we thank the first and next. Now let's move on to Hannah. Hannah, if you're ready, you may go ahead.
All right, sorry. I just need to set up my timer. Like Transformer says, that there's more to us than meets the eye, and that's exactly the attitude that we want children to have. We think that the notion that children are incapable of understanding complex characters and complex concepts in life just by the virtue of their young age is horrible. It's a shame that Site Negative doesn't want our children to be more critical, doesn't want our children to always constantly question the way things are in life. We think it's time for us to move on and see that our children are individuals who can think, are individuals who can rationalize concepts and try to understand the world as it is. What did Site Negative do? We think there's two burdens that Negative had to do that they were unable to fulfill. First, they needed to show why status quo allows for children to be more critical in the way that they perceive characters. And two, they need to show why the attitudes of filmmakers and how filmmakers no longer generalize characters have what we've already been laid down in first affirmative, and they need to show why these things are unlikely to be to materialize, because that's a crucial outcome that we wanted from first F. The fact that we want children to be able to understand complex characters, because if you don't expose them to these complex characters and complex concepts in life, they are unlikely able to be more critical. We think that will harm them in the long term. Now, let's just listen to what the materials from First Nec. I just want to answer the first thing, which is, are children capable of understanding complex concepts? Because the material from first net was that children are unable to do it. What did they say? I refuse, right, to let negative to say children are young, therefore they don't have the capacity to be able to learn things. They tried to prove this by two things. They tried to say that the reason why children cannot understand is because, one, they're young, and two, it harms them because it impacts the way they think. But if you really look at the way that they try to prove that material, there's no analysis to show us how exactly does children think, and why is it that we ought to expose children to like complex concepts in life. We think it's extremely embarrassing for the first negative to just generalize the way that children think. We think the response I have here is that we don't think that children are not capable of understanding complex concepts. Why is this the case? I have three reasons for this. The first is that children are individuals whose mental faculties are constantly developing. This is important because that means that they're trying to see the world around them. And this is also the stage where they are always curious about everything, right? Which means they always want to know about things. They want to know why things are different in their lives, why things are not the way that the TV shows, for example. What it means is that and this is particularly important because they are curious about everything, that means their thoughts are unlikely to be biased. Their thoughts are not fixed. Therefore, they're more willing to learn about different concepts in life. We think at that point, it's far easier for them to change their opinions, to always think about, am I right about this particular person at this point in time? So we don't think that children cannot comprehend complex sentences. But even if you don't buy that, I'll prove to you why in real life children can already rationalize complex concepts, because we've allowed children to comprehend complex things and make decisions based on those complex concepts. For example, we allow for children to choose in divorce cases who they don't want to live with. Do they want to live with mom? Do they want to live with dad? Right? Because courts and adults understand that children will be able to know, if I live with mom, how is my life going to be like? If I live with dad, how is my life going to be like? That means it is completely untrue that children cannot understand complex concepts in their lives. We think at this point, negative needs to show why it is untrue, why it is not true that children are incapable of understanding this. But then secondly, their material was also, what they said was that, they say it's good that we show only the good stuff because that means that blind optimism is always good. Let's just analyze the way that they tried to explain to prove that. They said because it's okay that we show children good stuff, because eventually they will know what's good or bad for them. But there's no analysis to show how is it that individuals can know what is good or bad, what kind of characters or what kind of people in their lives are good or bad. We think at that point there's no explanation at all. Therefore, the material cannot fly, right? They cannot claim the material. But let's assume that we can show blind optimism. They haven't shown at what point will these children think about how the people in their lives are not necessarily good or not necessarily bad. The way they say it was, but it's also good because we can allow children to idealize characters and the people in their life. But the argument is weird because there's no significance to show why is it that idealization is good or bad. But that's also unresponsive to the bulk of material from first F. The fact that when you idealize specific characters, you are more likely to not question what are the motives behind these particular characters. Why is it that a person become like an evil person when they're adults, for example? Or why is it that good characters can also be evil characters? For example, why your white Prince Charming can also be the same person who has invaded and destroyed like native communities, for example. At that point, your idealization actually makes it far harder for individuals to think about the other side of the person's personality, or what can this supposedly good person do wrong as well. That's why our material is particularly important. They were unable to respond. Why is it that absence of explicit categorization of person's trait, i.e. if you only tell this particular person is good or this particular person is evil, creates the illusion that individuals are simplistic, that individuals are easily defined, and you don't tell children that people can be complicated and that people can be complicated, and therefore we ought to know why is it that individuals are complicated. We think at that point, children are less likely to be critical in the way that they perceive their lives. And that's bad, especially when filmmakers can almost always associate certain races with certain traits. For example, your Prince Charming is always good looking, your Prince Charming is always white. Therefore, these traits, if you have these traits, means that you are more likely to be a good person. This is bad because it means that children are more likely to internalize those traits, just like how we perceive whites to be good, and like other traits or other communities are always the evil one. We think that at that point, you don't change any trends within society. We think that if you don't, if you filmmakers don't categorize if a person is good or bad, you force filmmakers to be more complex in the way that they characterize or the way that they perceive those, like the way that they show how characters ought to be. That's why this particular substantive is important, because we force filmmakers to stop generalizing certain characters with certain traits, because status quo is that the Prince Charming is always white and like always good looking, therefore he's always good. That means there's no like incentives for filmmakers to want to change the way that they show how certain characters ought to be. We have seen there's a trend of filmmakers doing this. Look at the bulk of Disney movies, from Cinderella to Barbie, for example. An amalgamation of those traits then allows for filmmakers to continue producing movies that unjustly represent certain communities. That means there's less incentive for filmmakers to create diverse characters, because it's just easier for us to market the fact that your white good-looking Prince Charming is always a good person, and that like the Hokage is always a good person, without knowing that he also destroys villages in those status quo. We think at that point, if you categorize these things for children, if you categorize certain characters for these children are unlikely to be critical, because you've already put a definition, that an unchangeable definition as to how certain characters ought to be. That means children are more likely to also excuse behaviors, because you perceive that, because like you make it to put it on their minds that like some people are always good or some people are always bad. We think it's bad because that shapes the way that they interact with other people as well. They're more likely to like not question, like for example, a father is supposed to be good, but they don't know perhaps that perhaps that it was wrong for them to hit you in that instance. We think at least on our side, we're able to have that unique exclusive benefit whereby we are able to allow for children to be more critical and at least question themselves. How is it that this character are evil? How is it that this character lives, and why is this character perceived as such? On the negative, there's no absolute platform for them to think about it, and we think you make children become even more vulnerable to society. Thank you.
Before the next speech, was it just me who had a lot of trouble and was seeing bandwidth is low, or was someone else also have trouble?
I didn't have that issue.
Me neither.
Okay.
Sure. Should we wait for you to set up your probably internet connection for a while?
Yeah. Can you fix that? Maybe I can turn off the camera to make sure that like nothing happens.
Yeah, that would.
Okay. Probably I can turn off.
I think one of you can. I think it's just two cameras and light stream that's.
Oh, I got that. So I'm going to turn off the video camera, which is much better to let the debaters, to show themselves.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Hello. I'm still okay. So how is it now? Is the bandwidth bad for you?
I think that you can open up your video camera.
It's fine. You can turn it on. Yeah.
Hold on.
Yeah.
Everything okay there? All right.
Sure. Is that okay for you?
All right.
Yeah.
Great.
Thank you so much. Wait. Just for safety, I'll switch from Wi-Fi to mobile data just to make sure there's no problem. Just give me 10 seconds.
Yeah, sure.
Yep, all done. Go ahead. You guys can keep the cameras on now. Thank you.
All right.
Good.
All right. So anytime, right?
Okay.
All right.
Anytime you're ready.
Okay. Ultimately, side affirmative lost this debate because they made two mistakes, which is firstly the failure to characterize properly what exactly is the stories that we teach in children's literature when it comes to good people or the glorification of good people. But secondly, it's also the fact that they chose the wrong priority in this debate, and I'll prove to you why. I think that let's just start with some extraneous rebuttals first. Firstly, they tried to tell us that the important thing within this debate is that we need to teach children complexity in order for them to grow up to become better people and to be able to empathize in that sense. We say that the process of adulthood or process of growing up is already sufficient in order for them to be able to learn the grays within life. Because note here, that is where you're more likely to be exposed to the more complex parts of life. For example, when people do bad things, even though you thought that person was a good person, right? Those gray things will be able to internalize later when you grow up. We think that the difference between childhood and adulthood is the amount of exposure that you have towards those things. And we think that the natural progression of life is going to expose you to those gray things anyway. And we don't see there's necessarily a need for you to be able to internalize this complexity at an extremely young age. But secondly, this is extraneously, the fact that they try to conveniently say that the only way for us to portray good characters if we show, good white guy like Superman or good white guy like white woman or Wonder Woman, without and showing that we can only demonize minorities or black people or whatever. We don't think that that's necessarily the case and what we need to defend. We could also include good things such as minority characters that are black, that are being glorified to be good, right? For example, Black Panther, Black Lightning, right? All of these things within children's literature are glorified, even if they're minority, people with uncontrollable characteristics of those individuals. And we think that that means then that that whole argumentation about them is not necessarily mutually exclusive. So lastly, right? I think we need to recharacterize what this debate really needs, right? Because what side affirmative doesn't understand is that in spite that children's literatures being able to impose certain moral structures within their stories, there exists already moral structures outside of the stories. For example, in things such as religion or just societal norms of what is good and what is bad. The problem with this is that they necessarily assign the values not on the character or the people who do those things, but on the actions themselves. For example, stealing is necessarily seen as a very bad thing, or hurting other people is seen as very bad, right? Not necessarily focusing on the person who do those things or the perpetrator who does those things. We think that what stories do is that they humanize the people who do those things or who do good things or bad, whether it be good things or bad things, and try to label those characters as good, not the actions or the actions they do, but the character in itself, right? So then this debate becomes two priorities. The first is that which side is able to teach a better form of morality onto children? And secondly, which side is able to allow children to become more confident and have a better childhood in itself? So firstly about who's able to imbue a better structure of morality within children. Firstly, I think we need to understand that when children are exposed to the literature of children's literature or that demonizes, glorifies good people or bad people, right? It shows that that person is good, even though they do sometimes they do bad things, right? For example, Robin Hood, the example that they cited, that person steals, but that person is an inherently good person because they steal in order to help the poor people who are starving on the side of the road. But also looks like superheroes in general, right? The fact that Spider-Man goes around literally beating up people, which is seen as a bad thing, but we see him or we glorify him as a good person because we know that that character is doing it for the sake of the greater good. So what does this teach children? It teaches kids that you can be good, irregardless of the circumstances or irregardless of what exactly circumstances that pushes you to become do bad things, right? For example, if you're growing up as a poor kid, right? If like if you're only exposed to the moral structure that is rigid in society, that is like stealing is bad, and you steal, you're obviously going to think that you're a bad person because you steal those things, right? The alternative is when you're able to glorify good characters and the fact that good characters can do bad things, which means then that you're able to have more confidence with yourself, that you can say that I'm still a good person. It's just that I had to steal in order to survive, right? But secondly, it's also the fact that we're able to teach empathy much better on our side, right? Why is this the case? Because the glorification of certain attributes of individuals, or the glorification of the character itself, means that we're going to show that character on the circumstances that shows that surrounds that person or that good character, right? For example, right, like a great example would be like Spider-Man, Zuko, for example, in the last Avatar that they tried to. The reason why he was pushed to the extreme where he had to destroy villages was because he was indoctrinated at a young age and pushed to the brim because of the structures that existed within that empire, right? The reason why we're able to empathize is because we assume that that person is good, but the circumstances were the ones that pushed him to the brink. And in the end of the day, the story does progress and shows and like pushes the actual good character of that person to be out at the end of the day. And we're able to empathize with those individuals. We think that what happens is that then our moral structures as children are more likely to be flexible, because the assumption when you see a person is going to be that that person is a good person, but we might be like pushed to the brim to do bad things, right? Because we already assume that that person is good. The alternative is where the moral structures that already exist within society, things such as religion or things such as the societal norms, are more likely to be more rigid and more likely going to push people to think that every action is bad, or like every bad action is bad and is not acceptable. Every action is good and should be done at all instances. We say that we are able to say that characters can be good and do bad things at the same time. And so the empathy, we deal that directly engages with whatever material that was coming up inside affirmative. Nextly, moving on to the second issue about the competence and the quality of childhood, and why exactly that the literature and the glorification of good characters is likely to become better, right? The first is that, like, when children are exposed to literature that tries to glorify good people, is that the assumption when they look at people around them that they are friends with is that they're more likely going to see those people as good people. And the assumption is that those people that you are surrounded by are inherently good characters, right? We think this is immensely important in order for the child to have a good quality childhood. Why is this the case? Firstly, it's because the fact that that child is more likely going to find comfort in the fact that I am surrounded by characters, even though that person, like the people around me might do bad things, I feel confident in the fact that I assume that these people are going to be good people. For example, my parents, right, who are probably struggling to make ends meet, might be forced to steal, but because I see those people and I inherently think that those people are good people, I assume that that person is I still find confidence in trying to lay with that person. The alternative is where you're likely to succumb to more rigid moral structures that I mentioned earlier, and you're more likely to judge those people based on what they do. The second important issue on confidence, right, is also the fact that when you glorify certain characters within children's literature, it leads to the idolization of that character, right? That means that that child wants to be that person or ascribes to be that person. We think that that means that gives a lot of confidence in children when it comes to like doing normal things. And we think this is important because, number one, this means that people have more confidence to enjoy life. Like these children have more confidence to enjoy life. But secondly, it's also the fact that these child are more likely to be more confident when it comes to exploring things that are important within their childhood. For all those reasons, go with side affirmative, negative.
Okay, Sean, are you two ready?
Yep.
Oh, perfect. So,
yep.
third F, you may go ahead.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Wait a minute. Okay, cool. Just time myself for a while. Okay, cool. I think Team Negative is very confused because on one side, like, in one speech, they say that apparently, like, literature isn't that completely important because individuals can just grow up and rationalize it by themselves, which means that as of this point, that means that they don't get the particular benefits that they don't get their benefits if they consider that literature isn't as important. But at the same time, they tell us that, oh, there are already moral structures that exist outside of this literature, so therefore this literature also doesn't matter. I think it's very unclear as to what they want at the end of the day. Do they want children to learn how to perceive the world and obtain information and for them to navigate through their lives with their relationships with other individuals through what they perceive from this literature, or do they want these individuals to learn it from other spaces? And I think they need to be quite clear as to what they want so that we can clearly see a lot of the benefits. But I'll be talking to you about a bunch of issues so we can see which side gets which, right? First and foremost, what are the key questions in today's debate? Number one, can children comprehend this now? Second, why do they need to do this now and not later? Third, let's talk about idolization and glorification, which is the bulk of the case coming from Team Negative. And fourth, like, on which side do children become better individuals as a whole? First and foremost, can children comprehend this now? We heard this from Negative a bunch of times, that they say that no, they're too young, children do not understand complex things, and that's why we need to just let them live life freely with blind optimism, without telling us as to why blind optimism as a whole is great also, right? I think blind optimism is just very, like, it fools children into thinking that the world is great and puts them into a reality that doesn't really exist. And by the time in which that exists, we think the harms have already happened to them because they never realized that they had to protect themselves in the first place. But talking about children being young, right? I think we've told you that because of the fact that they're young, that we need to do this now, because then the ability for us to shape their mindset, that shape their subconscious, is a lot better and a lot more effective, right? We think that we have to ensure that they can navigate through society in a way that best benefits them. Because they're young, they absorb things such as like sponges. I think children are very smart individuals. Most of the time they have a lot of empathy, and most of the time they are taught to be racist, they are taught to discriminate against other individuals, and they absorb things subconsciously, for example, right? I think that's why when when I was growing up watching white Disney princesses who were white, I absorbed it subconsciously for me that beauty most of the time is only looks like a white beautiful woman, and I'm Asian, therefore I'm not as beautiful. I can never reach that particular level of beauty. These are the kind of things in which children are able to absorb since a young age. So we don't understand why children apparently are just unable to, like, understand what these things are. But also, children also consume a lot of this literature along with their parents as well, with their friends, in order for them to navigate through it, in order for them to help themselves to understand. But even if they don't have individuals who help them navigate through it, we think it's just good for this literature to exist so that they could have some level of ability for them to start questioning these things. And we think that ability for them to even have that initial question is still an impact that we get on side affirmative that leads to individuals questioning the world, so they don't just take the world as it is, because we think that children who do that have a higher likelihood to be harmed at the end of the day. Why do they do it second? Why do they do this now and not later? Negative says that you don't need to learn this now, because children should be protected, that they can internalize these things later, they can unlearn these things later, because apparently the level of exposure to these complexities are things that come at a later part in life. As of that point, Team Negative hasn't provided us as to how these children will then navigate their lives through these terrible situations, right? That by that point in time, probably your parents have already been massive dicks to you. That at point in time, maybe your friends have manipulated you. At a point in time when that unlearning, in which you realize that your father isn't that great of a person, maybe the harms have already been accrued. Maybe at that point in time, you've already been harmed and are irrational and already have been a victim of manipulation. We think all these things are terrible. We think it's better for these individuals to understand that these things are happening as of now, so that they can best navigate through it and obtain less trauma as a whole. Second, let's talk about idolization and glorification. Negative says that it's good, that they want these children to be like this as much as possible, right? We're not saying that being good is terrible. We do not vilify individuals who be good. We want children to be good, but we also showcase children to be good that showcase them that being good means there's a journey, that sometimes individuals can falter, and you faltering, maybe sometimes being a bad person, is something that is okay and something that you can grow out of. Which is why I was very confused with the second negative speech, in which it seems like they're okay with a context in which, like, I don't know, Zuko's character arc is something that we obtain. Under your side, you do not provide these children these things because you have to completely show an individual being good and an individual being idolized to an extent, like Superman, where he can never do anything wrong. That's the kind of world in which you live in. That's the characterization that you have to defend. We think that idolization and glorification, and that these characters are infallible, they cannot falter, they never do things wrongly. In the circumstances where now children fall short in their attempt to be good people, we think that it makes them even more, they blame themselves even more. We think children are a lot more anxious to make mistakes. We think children put very high expectations on themselves, like Asian children do most of the time, in which they are very afraid of disappointing other individuals, right? We think idolizing individuals as well is quite a terrible thing to do. I think idolizing your parents, they haven't told us why it's great, by the way, just besides saying that, oh, now they will want to be these things. I think children would still want to be good because, like, you gain affirmation from being good. Society tells you that being good is great. So children would naturally have an incentive to be good, because if you're evil, then people wouldn't like you, people want to be friends with you. But also, I think idolization is terrible because it means that you are more likely to make excuses for individuals who are doing harm to you, but because you idolize them and you perceive them as good, that means that you make excuses and you don't keep them accountable. That means you do not speak up when there is abuse, or where they are manipulating you, or where they are making you feel bad. We think children are less likely. That means you, under your side, you create children that are less likely to question and analyze their relationships and interactions with other individuals, because they think that individuals can only be capable of doing good and some individuals can only be bad. There's no in the gray area in which they are able to understand as to why individuals are like that. I think under your side, children are has less ability to become empathetic because they never question these things, because they never have an incentive to understand as to why people are like that, because of what happened in the in-betweens, in the gray areas. Your side vilifies individuals even more. I think under our side, these children have an ability to think for themselves, right? And I think that as of that point, in which when the harms have existed, by the point in time in which they're old, they are less likely to, the part in which they unlearn about this glorification and idolization is very harmful and very traumatic as of that point. And we think that's terrible, and they haven't told us how do they navigate through these things. Lastly, on which side do children become better individuals? I think good individuals are good individuals who try. On side negative, these are we believe that children have less incentive to do so, because the standard of being a good person is really high and unrealistic. Because children's literature, for example, showcases to you that in order for you to be a good person, you have to be like Cinderella. She never spoke up against all the abuses. She just smiles, she just cries, and apparently good things happen to good people. Well, in real life, this doesn't really happen. Sometimes you have to speak up. Sometimes some harm has to occur in order for you to gain some level of justice, right? Like Kyoshi says, sometimes justice is the only thing that can bring peace. Sometimes you do have to create harm into other individuals so that they do not do harm unto others. These are the kind of things that we get under our side. These are the kind of characters that we showcase to children, right? That you can sometimes make mistakes, and that we are the side that showcases the journey. So we have the chances in which children now have an ability to try to be good as possible, and even if they fail, it is still fine. You can still get a second chance, and you can still be a good individual. Never been prouder to propose.
Okay, we thank third F. Now let's invite third neg.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, quite clear.
Thank you. Let me get my timer. 1 second. panel, side affirmative's whole case is contingent on the fact that these children will have the extreme rational capability to think those gray areas overnight and judge them and act upon them. We say on the counterfact that this is not possible without the natural progression. We gave 3 reasons why. Firstly, natural progression gives you those natural realizations coming forward to experiencing these lives. That means side affirmative had to prove from the very beginning that why this is very much urgent to expose these children with the harsh reality of life, even if they do not experience at the same point of time in their life. That means the moment when you want to make these children's life better, you do not do it, but you do it worse, because now you are putting them in questions, you putting them their thoughts in questions, what to do, what not to do, because everything is ambiguous right now. We contest that idea from the very beginning, and we say to you that our world where these black and white filters, where the standard the preset moralities are already there, it's very much easier for these children to know that this is good and I have to do good, and that is bad and I cannot do bad regardless any circumstances, versus the world where at a very critical age all of the decision making processes are questionable, because now from these literatures and from these films, you know that everything is ambiguous, everything is questionable, and this world is harsh. That means the implications of these actions from those decision making processes are also questionable for these children. That means the moment when they would do something bad, they wouldn't justify themselves that this is bad, because they would learn that, oh, everything is good or everything is bad, or nothing is good and nothing is bad. That means there is no check and balance that you can teach these children how to build their character from the very beginning. 2 things in this debate, and we think that's priority to win. Firstly, which side gives the children a better childhood? And secondly, who helps these children to take better decisions for their life? Let's engage with the first context. We think that there was no urgency for the affirmative side and coming up and say that, oh, this life is real harsh at the age of 20, at the age of 24, you have to see a real harsh life. That's why you need to know how this life is bad from at your age of 5 or 6. We think that this is really complicating for these children. We from the very beginning say to you that why these hyper complex and critical thoughts make these children's mind more critical, and these implications are harmful for their decision making process. Even if like these harsh, and even if they get to expose these harsh realities, we think that this also is harmful, and this has some damaging impacts on their emotions as well. That means the outcome that this side affirmative is expecting, which is more healthy mental health and everything, that doesn't happen, because now every single question in their mind is, oh, this world is harsh, how do I survive within this? People are not good, and I really cannot idolize anything, no one. So we think that this is really important to note. But secondly, why natural progression of understanding is really important in our context and in our world. We think from the natural progression of understanding, it is also important to note that the capability of this natural progression is also important, because by the age you have those capabilities ongoing, and by the age within staying those capabilities, you have those realizations to judge those gray criterias, to judge those gray contexts within the gray context. That means without those natural capabilities and the progression of capabilities, you will be lost within your thoughts, which gray area is good and which is bad, and then your actions will be bad as well. The second issue that we bring, we think that we better help these children to make better decisions. Firstly, why idealization will not is the most important for these children, and it is not any excuse that the side affirmative is claiming. We think that by these, we contested from the very beginning that idealization is important, because there are some moral preset standards are there that you cannot steal or you cannot harm, you cannot attack to any other children, because this is bad, because this your a hero do not do this, your hero do not beat the good people, your friends. That means these are the following, these are the good morals that these children has to follow constantly. And this constant manner is really, really important. In their world, this consistency of doing more and more good things doesn't happen inside affirmatives case. So we think that we also need to recognize why these idealizations are really, really important, because now the character building happens in a more specific way. And the more you expose these children with these literatures who tell you that your hero does good, even if he is in a bad circumstance where he might have chosen the bad things, but still he's doing the right, that means you are also a good person who can choose the right decisions. That means here is the distinction, which decision is bad and which decision is good, and these children go for always the good, because now they have the incentive to follow, because now they can relate to those people. This part of analysis is really, really important from our side. We have always said to you that those beauty standards from Cinderella or those princesses or white standards are not always true. That means the moment when those children can relate as a child, if I can, as a black child, if I can relate to the Black Panther, my idol would be Black Panther. I want to be like him. I want to follow his ethics. That doesn't mean that I always know that, oh, a white guy, tall white guy, muscular guy is always important to follow. That means the relatability is also very important within this age. And all of this happens within those natural progressions from the very beginning. We say lastly, the check and balance system, the moment when you give a very questionable and ambiguous context for these children that, oh, this is your decision to judge which one is good and which one is bad, that means that you leave no self-criticism mechanism within these children. That means there's no check and balance system. The moment when you say that your idols do these good things and this set of bad things, that means there will still be a mechanism of self-criticism. That means you can always check with that means as a child you can always check all of your behaviors are matching to your idol or not. That means, are you doing good or bad? That means the self actualization happens more and more within those states. We think that these are the very important factors to note. But lastly, which context we really would take from the debate from the very beginning? We think that the moment when, as a person, or the moment where, as a kid, when you know that nothing is good or nothing is bad, that means that these decisions, that these all of this world, all of these behaviors towards your parents, towards your friends, and towards the other people you interact in daily life, this happens in a very ambiguous way. That means you really cannot say that my friend is good, because now everything is questionable to you. That means those things affect your mind and affect to your consequences as a whole. We think that we bring two key factors in this debate. We think that the childhood we give to these children is far more simple, better, and full, and with a net happiness within it. And secondly, we think that in our world, children can do better decision makings. Very proud to oppose.
Hi, hold on. Okay, I can be heard, right? Just to be.
And if you would prefer, you may open up your video camera.
All right, sure.
Thank you very much.
I think side affirmative failed when they failed to take into account the characterization or the context that already exists for children. That is, that moral structures outside of this literature that they try to tell you already exist. In my speech, I already mentioned. I told you things such as religion, societal expectations that tend to be extremely rigid and tend to ascribe value not on character, but rather on certain actions, whether they be good or bad. For example, in religion, it is assumed that stealing is automatically bad and doing good is automatic, like helping other people is automatically good, right? We say that this debate then becomes a question, and I already explained it, that how is it, which sides children's literature is better able to deal with the outside rigid moral structure that already exists, and why is it that we're able to provide a better childhood for these children? So the first, who teaches a better moral structure when it comes to these children, and who is able to deal with the moral rigid structure that exists already, right? The first is that side affirmative. Firstly, the assumption is that side affirmative tried to tell you that, okay, children need to learn complexities of life immediately at a very young age in order for them to be able to deal with life, right? The first two issues, the first two questions that pop up from this piece of material is that firstly, they never prove to you why the cognitive ability of these children are likely to be good as well, because we already told you that when you're a child, obviously you're like, you don't already have the experiences, or you don't have the experiences of the complexities of life already in the first place, which means that it's hard for you to even comprehend all those things. But secondly, even if you assume that they are able to comprehend, we don't think that that necessarily overcomes the moral structures that already exist outside, right? I already told you that is already tend to be rigid. And so what that means then is that even if you teach everything to be gray or whatever, it's likely that they're going to have their own judgments that are already based on the moral structures that exist already out there. For example, if they see a story that like doesn't try to glorify stealing, for example, they'll still put value on that, that doesn't glorify any characters, that doesn't glorify any actions. They still ascribe value to that action within that literature, because the moral structures outside of the story already exist. And so that value judgment means that it exists. What is the alternative that we told you? We told you that firstly, that in the character, the most important thing about people is not necessarily the actions that they do, which might be good or bad, but the character itself. That is, that people are inherently good, or can be inherently good, or inherently evil. We told you that that means then that they're more likely to find, they're more likely to do things, they're more likely to be empathetic towards individuals, or they're more likely to do good things in spite of the circumstances, because of the fact that they understand that people can be good irregardless of the consequence, irregardless of the circumstances, or irregardless of the circumstances that push them to do bad things, right? We think that that means we're able to deal with the moral structures out there much better, and we're able to teach a more concrete, a more flexible moral structure that is likely to be helpful for the children. But secondly, the happiness and enjoyment of childhood, right? The material that was provided by Side Affirmative is that they try to tell us that children already face a lot of problems in life, and like they're likely to need to deal with these problems immediately. Firstly, the first question I need to ask is that why is it likely that these children are going to face problematic things? Because we already told you that it's likely that these children, because they're children, obviously they're going to be protected, right? We think that they're already guided in life through things as teachers and parents, right? And so we don't think necessarily there's a need for them to deal with that. Even if that is the case, we think that it only is affected by a very small minority of children. What do we provide to you? Firstly, we provide to you that the idealization that comes from the glorification of good characters means that then people have better confidence, or children have better confidence when it comes to themselves, because they relate to those characters or that are being glorified, and they find confidence in the fact that they can feel like they are Superman or they're Spider-Man, right? And they can be good even though they might be forced to do bad things, or they might be pushed to the brink. But secondly, it's also the fact they have confidence and they in other people that they can be good. The automatic assumption around other people is that they are inherently good, and they feel comfortable around those other people. And lastly, these children are more likely to have blind confidence, and more likely to enjoy their childhood and enjoy the formative years of their life much better. For all those reasons, go with side negative.
Should I go right away, or?
Thank you very much.
Oh.
Whenever you are ready.
Cool. Two technical points before I move on to the actual matter of how the debate went. The first is in regards to this weird co-opting mechanism that was employed by the side of negative by saying that, oh, they're the side that gives more moral flexibility towards children, at the point where children can justify to themselves that they're still good people, even though the perhaps do certain bad people. But the reason as to why it is extremely weird and it actually is inconsistent, it's for the fact that they actually used our examples like Zuko, for example, and the contextual basis in which why Zuko can be viewed as good or bad at the same time. They need to tell us the delineation between when a character is definitely good or inherently good, or definitely bad or inherently bad. How is it then children suddenly are able to reconcile with the fact that, oh, if they were to do the bad things at that particular moment, they're still a good person because of the fact that the delineation between good and bad is that clear. That is the nuance that have been missing out even within their own case. That inconsistency even harmed their own arguments. But the second technical point that I want to point out is in regards to this weird argument about religion and other moral structures still exist outside of the storybook. Well, if that is true, then the rigidity of those moral structures is what gives more weight towards our argument in regards to providing children the capacity to know that stories should that decisions should be judged based on the stories themselves, based on the context, and based on why those individuals decide on to make those particular decisions to even begin with. So at that point of time, even their argument is literally coinciding with the arguments that we're currently making. So I have two questions for you today. The first, how would children interpret and internalize the values in children's literature? And secondly, how does children literature affect them in the future? So in the first question, how would children interpret children's literature? I just want to make this clear because there's this absurd accusation coming from the side of negative that claims that, oh, children aren't smart, they wouldn't be able to break the concepts and complex concepts of those things. Well, we agree. We're not saying that they're that smart that they're able to provide a thesis about Snow White. What we're saying is with normalization and normalized consumption of those kind of materials, the learning curve of children in being able to consume that larger amount of information makes them able to then make decisions themselves based on those stories. But it's also secondly that children are not as dumb as what society thinks they are, that they are capable of access to technology, for example, that they're capable of empathy that at least allows them to understand the complexity of those issues and the stories that we are trying to fight for under our seventh house. They at least have that basis of reasonable ability to then understand the reason as to why individuals make certain decisions. That isn't that hard to have. They don't have to have a master's for that. That's why our benefits can still be accrued. Then they told us, well, they're still dumb and they're too young to understand. Well, even under yours, you say that there's this weird idea about natural progression and children being able to learn about moral flexibility. But if you consider children as stupid, then your benefits are largely minimalized as well. There's this inconsistency harms the case coming from side negative as well. Then there must be a reasonable way for us to characterize children, and there is some capacity for them to be able to understand those complex stories. Now, second question, how does the children literature affect them in the future? They say that blind optimism is good so that clear moral structures can be given to children. Responded to this in a few ways. The first is that the reality of the world just makes this blind optimism toxic. Given that there is a clear association with good towards white people and a clear association of bad with black people or people of color, for example, those things means that it becomes much harder for children to be able to gain all the moral values of not being judgmental, for example, within the world of side negative. But the second reason that we provided particularly for this is that blind optimism also makes children force themselves to become overly critical towards themselves at the point where stories tell them that they have to act a certain way to be good. At that point of time, if they don't reach that standard, they punish themselves, they resort to harmful behaviors that can often lead to death and suicide. Thanks.
We thank both teams for a very wonderful debate, and probably you can across the virtual meeting room and shake hands.